Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this National Housing Federation webinar. My name is Bethan Buck. I am an External Affairs Manager at the NHF, and my pronouns are she and her. In recognition of LGBT+ History Month, we have been inspired to run this session on the history of LGBTQ+ housing in England. Our speakers today are going to take us through some of the key events and milestones in recent LGBTQ+ history with reflections from their own experiences. We're also going to hear about how crucial housing services for LGBTQ+ people are still today and find out from each of our speakers about the unique provisions their organisations have for LGBTQ+ people. We've got a whole hour for this session, and each of our 4 speakers will have at the start 6 to 7 minutes each, meaning that we'll then have a good half hour for questions as well. Our speakers today are Tina Warthen, who is Director of Education and Engagement at Stonewall Housing. We've also got John Glenton, who's Executive Director of Care and Support at Riverside. We've got Anna Keir, CEO of Tonic Living and also co-chair of House Proud. And we've got Guy Stenson, who's Director of Housing Operations at Stonewater. We've also got support from James from the NHF's digital team and Becca, our events manager, as well. If this is your first GoToWebinar, there are just a few things to look out for on your dashboard. You can close the panel using the red arrow so you can see more of the speakers and presentations. If you have any issues with sound, just check the audio tab. Please do ask questions throughout the webinar. You can do this in the questions tab in your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible in our Q&A session at the end. Please note, however, that we will only guarantee we'll be able to answer questions that were sent during the presentation and not after it. It's also worth noting that we will be sending all attendees an email in the next week or so, which will include a link to a recording of this webinar. And Tina, if we're ready to kick off, I'm going to hand straight over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much, Bethan, and thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a bit about, I should say, first of all, my name's Tina. As Bethan said, I'm Director of Education and Engagement for Stonewall Housing. Been working for Stonewall Housing for about 9 years now. My pronouns are she and her. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of housing, but also talk about the history of Stonewall Housing. We have quite a long history. And so if I start by talking about what's happened in terms of the history for LGBTQ housing, often set against a background of criminalisation. I didn't realise until I started looking that the first laws passed against being homosexual were passed in 1533 by Henry VIII, and they weren't repealed until 1864 when the death penalty was removed. And I hadn't really realised that. But we have a long history of LGBTQ responses to insecure and unavailable housing, from the South London Gay Liberation Community Centre, which was an empty shop that was squatted in the 1970s, which was associated with a lot of squatted houses in Railton Road in Brixton, and is referred to as, the whole thing is referred to as Brixton Ferries, to current groups like London Older Lesbians Co-housing and the innovative Tonic project, which you'll hear about from Anna later on. We've always had this history of responding, often in an activist way, to insecure housing. Projects like the Outside Project, which is a relatively new project as a response to LGBTQ homelessness, is the only LGBTQ emergency shelter in the UK, the only one, and it has 12 bed spaces and 4 spaces for domestic abuse beds. You know, that's not a huge amount of spaces. So in all of that history, Stonewall Housing came about in 1983, and that was the kind of early years of the HIV and AIDS crisis, right at the very beginning. And 5 people got together, 2 of whom had experienced homelessness when they came out, and decided to set up a housing co-op of 8 bed spaces, a safe space for LGBTQ young adults to stay. That 8 bed property is still part of our portfolio, and a very small beginning to our organisation. We were the first organisation to receive funding from the GLC, specifically to look at housing need and support. And at a time when the HIV and AIDS crisis focused attention on the LGBT community, you know, the front pages of the tabloids were full of you know, it's a gay plague, that kind of thing. And HIV status decided whether you got a mortgage or not, or whether you were evicted from housing for being gay. That still happens now. We have recently had cases, a case of someone who's HIV positive who's been evicted by a landlord illegally for being HIV. You know, add section 28 into that equation. Section 28, which said that you were not allowed to promote homosexuality as part of normal family values, and that was kind of May 1988. That wasn't repealed until 2003. What if you add that to the equation, coming out and finding safe spaces to live becomes even more difficult. And throughout the whole of that period, Stonewall Housing continued to run this very small 8-bed service, this small safe space. You know, fast forward that a number of years, 2021, and LGBTQ people are still struggling to find safe spaces to live. We now have 41 bed spaces, including that original 8-bed space, which is for LGBTQ young people between 16 and 25 who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. We have floating support and resettlement work. Our helpline and advocacy service worked with over 1,200 people last year. And that's quite a lot of people in terms of housing need, insecure housing, people who've been evicted, people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And we saw a marked increase over the period of COVID, over the COVID lockdowns. We saw a huge increase in our numbers, and particularly an increase in much older people contacting us. So I think the oldest person we're working with at the moment is about 78. So we've seen a marked increase in all our numbers, but particularly for older people. So our portfolio also includes quite a lot of training. And for us, training is a really important thing for housing providers to do. And from housing training about domestic abuse, mental health, older people, talking about kind of generic awareness training, our bespoke portfolio covers all of those topics. We trained something like 500 people last year, and we trained from senior managers to frontline workers to maintenance operatives. And House Proud, No Place Like Home research particularly pointed out, it was research done with social housing tenants, and that particularly pointed out that 21% of the people that they spoke to didn't feel safe with operatives in their homes, and they take down anything that might indicate they're gay. One of the people that I was working with called it de-gaying their house, because they don't feel comfortable with operatives in their houses. And that's a particular piece of training that we're working quite hard on at the moment. We think it's really important that we support housing providers to support their LGBTQ customers, and our role is to in that training particularly is to make sure that providers do best practice for their LGBTQ tenants, definitely. And we have our vision is we have kind of, our vision is full of supporting providers to do the best for their tenants. And you know, we've come a long way from 1983 to 2021, but we're still finding people who are prejudiced against because of their LGBTQ status. That was my very quick run through history. So I'm going to hand over to John, who's Executive Director of Care and Support for Riverside Housing.
Thank you, Tina, and good morning. So I plan to talk about some recent LGBTQ history, a piece of history that I lived through, and it's a period in the 1980s and early 90s when the world was a very different place for gay people. And coming out in the mid-80s as a young gay man, I'm going to share some of my own experiences and just how challenging and difficult and different it was back then. So the first thing is that the age of consent for gay people, gay men back then, was 21, and it was 16 for straight people, and the legislation was silent for gay women. So why did that matter? That meant that if you were a 21-year-old gay man and your boyfriend was 19, if you were prosecuted, you'd be classed as a sex offender. So that was a very different way of looking at things to where we are now. And that legislation was only fully changed to be equalised in the year 2000. So there was no positive role models that I remember. In fact, quite the opposite. Coming out as a gay person back then for a pop star or an actor or a sports personality was career ending. That's what it was considered to be, career ending. And now we people use the term hostile environment. That's exactly how it felt. We lived through a hostile environment. The HIV and AIDS pandemic created genuine fear and panic among society. And lots of the hostility around that was directed at gay men. Gay bars were closing. The staff were fearful that they'd be infected with HIV/AIDS virus from us. And at the time, back in 1985, I was a member of an LGBTQ youth group. And the youth service wouldn't let us use any of their facilities. And one of their main reasons for not allowing us to use their facilities was that they didn't have separate toilets for us to use. And they felt that there was a risk of us infecting other young people with the HIV virus by sharing toilets. And I mean, that was a really difficult message to hear. And of course, something that you would never hear now. So I trained as an HIV and AIDS volunteer counsellor, and I worked on a helpline. And our key message was around listening to people and to promote safer sex. There wasn't any real treatment or a cure back then. So we didn't direct people to be tested. If they wanted to talk about having a test, that was fine, but there was many implications just by having a test, regardless whether your results were positive or negative. So even if your results was negative from a test, some people would consider that to be an admittance that you'd lived a risky lifestyle, therefore you'd been exposed to that risk. So there was no chance of getting a mortgage, no chance of getting life insurance, even travel restrictions to some parts of the world. As I've said, there was really no effective treatment, and very sadly, the increase in mental health, depression, but also people who decided to commit suicide after a positive test was just all too common. We did talk about the ability to have an anonymous test, but that was often challenged by health professionals who wanted ID, who wanted date of birth and wanted to know who you were. At the same time, LGBTQ hate crime, or queer bashing, as it was known then, was just commonplace and accepted as part of the risks that we lived with. And whilst all of this was happening, Tina mentioned section or clause 28, the government decided to introduce this change in legislation, and as Tina said, it banned the promotion of homosexuality in schools. But it also within the text said that it banned the promotion of teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretend family relationship. And I just remember that as a pretend family relationship. So we were fearful as a community for ourselves and our friends. We were fearful because we were being blamed for the virus in the press. It was called the gay plague. And there was little interest from governments or large drug companies in terms of putting any kind of money towards finding a cure. And the fear and ignorance wasn't limited just to the general population. It was also around within the healthcare professionals. And many people who had tested positive and developed symptoms related to the AIDS virus was treated really in a horrific way, sometimes inhumane, locked in isolation wards, not allowed visitors. Many families disowned their sons. Families banned long-term partners from being able to visit or even attend funerals. And it's estimated now that over 35 million people have died worldwide since the onset of the AIDS pandemic, HIV and AIDS pandemic. But along with the pandemic came so much direct discrimination. And Tina mentioned some of this around landlords directly discriminating, not allowing two men to rent a flat together. Completely really challenging to find a mortgage. Also, many hotels wouldn't allow two men to book a double room with a double bed. Some holiday companies said male and female couples only. You weren't allowed to serve in the military. So there was a whole host of direct discrimination that was just something that we learned to live with. And the time and effort and energy that needed to go into sometimes pretending that you're someone different, not being able to be yourself, could be very wearing. And in some respects, I was very lucky. I had good friends and I had good family support. But I remember working as a support worker in a homeless hostel in the mid-80s, and my boss told the probation officer that I was gay and I would make a really good key worker for sex offenders. What the connection was, I still struggle with, but that was the type of thing that was just acceptable then. And as a person in a relationship, my partner trained as a primary school teacher, and I remember we had one car then, and I used to drop him 3 streets away because he would have lost his job back in the early 90s as an out primary school teacher, teaching reception, 5-year-olds. So we really thought he would have lost his job, and that was just things that happen to people. So things have changed so much now. And if I think about the changes in equality laws, the changes in gay marriage, but generally the changes the way society accepts the LGBT community. Not all of the LGBT community, and it's not the same for everybody, but we've made massive progress. So Riverside, the organisation I work for, we've been in the Stonewall Top 100 companies as an LGBT inclusive employer for the past 7 years. We have an active LGBTQ staff group. We have an active allies group. Our chief exec is a visible ally. Our chief financial officer is a visible role model as a gay woman. You know, I'm a gay man and I'm the senior champion. We have annual LGBTQ customer conferences. We have an online LGBT customer forum. All of our policies and procedures are put through our LGBT staff group. And we've just opened our very first dedicated LGBTQ homeless service in Manchester. We've been delivering an awful lot of training, and we work with Tina and her colleagues over time delivering training. So our staff are fully equipped and our tenants have got increased awareness. Our governance community have got the level of awareness that they need so that we can provide services that are truly inclusive. We have signed the House Proud Pledge that Tina talked about, and we were one of the housing associations who funded the research into the experiences of social housing tenants who are LGBTQ. So the world is a very different place 35 years on, and I'm really pleased and proud to be part of the progress that's been made. But what I would say is that it's not the same for everybody, even in this country, but particularly in some parts of the world. I believe today there are 9 countries in the world where being a gay man, being a homosexual man, is punishable by death. And I still find that really difficult to say, but just for being who you are, just for being a gay man, it's punishable by death. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm going to hand you over now to Anna, who's going to carry on with the presentations. Thank you.
Anna, I think you're on mute.
Hello. Sorry about that. I pressed the webcam share and not the mute. I was just going to say thank you very much to John for that very poignant story. For those of you who've recently been watching It's Sin, I saw that it was profiled first of all by Channel 4 as a very uplifting story. And for those of us that lived through that time, there was clearly joy of community. It's a very difficult time to remember, but I think it's important that we do remember, and that series really brought it to life. So just to introduce myself, my name's Anna, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Chief Executive of Tonic Housing. We're based in London. I'm also the co-chair of House Proud, the network group for LGBT people working in social housing. I'll start by giving you a bit of a background about Tonic in case you've not heard about us. Tonic's a community-led housing association run by and for older LGBT people. Tonic's focused on creating vibrant and inclusive urban LGBT affirming retirement communities where people can share common experiences, find mutual support and enjoy their later life. We will be providing accommodation with safe social spaces where older LGBT people are supported, gain life-affirming social connections, and can access culturally appropriate services. There's currently no specific LGBT housing with care provision for older people anywhere in the UK. So we were set up in 2014 to change this, and we're working towards launching our first homes actually in just a few months' time. So you might be wondering what LGBT affirming means. Well, really, that's our whole approach to services and the support. We're not saying we're just going to be LGBT friendly, but we're actually going to be genuinely affirming of the lives, histories, needs and desires of LGBT people. And this term doesn't imply exclusion of those who don't identify as LGBT, but it actually is all about actively valuing those who respect and celebrate LGBT people and their lives and culture. I'm often asked why this type of housing is needed, and there's really two answers to that, both of which reflect the historic and sometimes current discrimination that older LGBT people face. We know from research that in addition to the issues of ageing, LGBT people compared to the general population have generally had worse health outcomes, are more likely to live alone, be single and less likely to have children and family support, something which we heavily rely on in this country in our care system. They're also less likely to feel a sense of belonging to their local community and often feel that their specific needs are not considered for in their care. The second answer is actually from LGBT people directly themselves. They want somewhere that they feel safe and to be with other LGBT people, to be part of a community and have conversations and activities based on shared life experiences, which can be very different to the general standard older person's housing provision for the older population. Where often many of the conversations are around things such as your grandchildren. Our Builder Safing Choices 2020 report on LGBT later life housing demand in London was a collaborative action research study undertaken with Opening Doors London and Stonewall Housing. It's the largest piece of detailed work to capture the voices of older LGBT people in London about their housing needs. Now, neither the GLA or the London boroughs had any data on this need, so we actually undertook this important work ourselves as a community-led initiative to provide that evidence base for improved strategic planning. But the issue of housing and support needs of older LGBT people is not new. In 1993, Polari Housing Association was established by lesbian and gay men to meet a need that they felt was not represented within existing housing and community care provision. Polari was actually registered with the Housing Corporation, and they undertook the first detailed research on the housing and support needs of older lesbians and gay men, which was called As We Grow Older. But Polari decided not to set up their own housing project, despite that being their original intent, due in part to the lack of funding. Now, this was during the Section 28 years that have been mentioned by Tina and John, which was only repealed in 2003. So Polari decided to work with existing providers to try and improve services for older people through their Polari Partnership project that was carried out in the early noughties. Unfortunately, that work, a lot of that work had limited impact, and as has been demonstrated by the House Proud report that was mentioned, No Place Like Home, and these issues are still being experienced by LGBT social housing residents currently, although some providers are making really good progress on this now. At Tonic, we take a very human approach to our community and customers. I've had the chance to speak with several people about their LGBT housing histories. Tina mentioned the Brixton Ferries and the Rowton Road Centre in Brixton in the 1970s. And if you haven't seen the short film on this called Brixton Ferries Made Possible by Squatting, I highly recommend it. It's on YouTube and easy to find. I also went a couple of years ago on a queer history tour of Deptford, and there it was kind of highlighted the social housing that was used because it was hard to let by LGBT community members. And that included a stop at a place called the Pink Palace. I've no idea if it's the same Pink Palace that was referred to in It's a Sin, but it's interesting that that was, if there maybe were a couple of them. One conversation that I particularly remember about this time last year was with the author Juno Roche, and she talked about her experience of an LGBT squat in East London. And we started chatting about how we should try and capture these stories and the undocumented LGBT housing history in England. So Tonics recently put a call out for people to get in touch about their housing histories and their experiences. So if any of you out there listening have some interesting stories to share with us, please do get in touch. And what we're trying to do is actually get some funding so we can actually write this history up in a book, so that it's not lost and not forgotten. One final example that I came across by talking to one of our potential customers is an organisation called Stratton Housing Association, which was run in the 1980s, and this was actually providing housing and support to people with HIV and AIDS. And I understand that's now being subsumed into general housing association properties. So just to finish off, this LGBT housing history that I've been talking about has actually directly informed Tonic's work. We want to ensure that what we do actually creates a community asset in perpetuity, so we can ensure that the homes that we create continue to be available for our community. So we're actually going to own our first properties. These are going to be available for shared ownership sale. We're not yet able to do rented housing because we are not yet a registered provider of social housing. We intend to be, and we intend to register so that we can provide rented housing in future. But first of all, we've got to own our first properties in order to make that application. So I'm now going to hand over to Guy from Stonewater, who's going to carry on this discussion.
Thank you. Well, how do I follow those sessions? So for this last one, I'm going to focus on some of the work that we're doing today at Stonewater. But to introduce myself, I'm Guy Stenson. I'm the Director of Housing Operations at Stonewater. Just very briefly, my pronouns are he and him. Very briefly, Stonewater is a national housing provider with around 33,500 homes spread the length and breadth of England, from North Yorkshire down to Devon. It's a mix of affordable housing, shared ownership, retirement living and supported living, including our specialist services working with survivors of domestic abuse. Our domestic abuse services predominantly work with women and children survivors of domestic abuse, but we have a team in Southampton working with people with particularly complex needs, and in Bedford working with women and children from South Asian communities. But it's about our especially established LGBTQ safe space in Swindon that I want to speak about today, and the work that we do with survivors from within the LGBTQ communities. All of those, and the work that we do sits alongside, complements and supports the wider provision around domestic abuse in each of the communities that we work. We recognise that anybody can be affected by domestic abuse, regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status or background. Even before the pandemic, estimates acknowledge that domestic abuse amongst lesbian, gay men and bisexual people was around 1 in 3 to 1 in 4. And amongst trans people, it's 80%. Yes, 80% of trans people would acknowledge that they have experienced domestic abuse at some point in time. And that's a time where we know there's very limited provision across the country that is able to meet their particular needs. All of our refuges and safe spaces at Stonewater are inclusive. We won't turn anybody away simply because of their any of their particular needs. What we seek to do is to understand them as an individual and look how best we can support them with any of our services. And if we can't, how best we can connect them with provision externally. LGBTQ plus domestic abuse isn't just about violence from a partner. It includes abuse inflicted by homophobic, biphobic or transphobic parents or households. And this, sadly, is an area we've seen increasingly prevalent within the last 12 months, particularly as we've seen younger people return back home to live with families during the lockdown period. At the start of the pandemic, at Stonewater, we recognised that we needed to do more to make sure that we could keep our doors open to anybody who needed a safe space to live in line with our vision that everybody has an opportunity to have a place that they can call home. And we took time to reflect on how we delivered our services, particularly in relation to our domestic abuse services. And our LGBT safe space, which offers refuge-style accommodation in Swindon, we're seeing increased demand, particularly from people with a BAME background. So we looked at how we can make sure that we can increase that provision, and introduced what we've called a virtual refuge model, which combines the ability to provide a safe space to live with person-centred support. That opened in May last year and has enabled us to provide an additional 20 spaces at any one time to support people in need from any particular community, and enables us to match to use our specialist domestic abuse coaches from within our LGBTQ services with individuals wherever they may well be living. So we offer that warm and inclusive welcome whilst continuing to blend support with those specially trained workers and our local teams. It means that we can accommodate people within, not just within our specialist refuges, but within other accommodation that we have available, perhaps within our young people's housing services or in our retirement living schemes, where we have on-site teams, but they can be complemented by the provision of support from our LGBT refuge service. And just to talk just very briefly about one story of an individual who's recently come through the service in Swindon. So Janine, who identifies as a trans woman, came to us having fled from very serious domestic abuse in her family over a sustained period of time. Her brothers had been violent towards her on multiple occasions, and when they both lived in their father's home, and she would often go and stay with friends. But on one occasion, she'd returned home to collect a few items and clothing, and she overheard a brother and her father haggling over how much her father would pay the brother to kill her. Janine recognised that she needed to get out to protect her own life, and she found the courage to contact Gallup, who in turn helped her to find her way to our service in Swindon. So Janine, since Janine arrived with us, she's flourished. She's really got involved in the community, established connections with local trans support group. She's been involved in setting up an International Women's Day event, and she's engaged with a local support group to promote support for older LGBTQ people locally. And she's recently been offered a flat in London Borough, where she's able to put down roots and establish a new life. Janine's story is unique to her, and what we see is that people who come to us each and every one of their experiences is very different and unique. But what we're able to do is make sure that the team around everybody is able to understand their particular needs, provide a very personalised support, and to make sure that we can help people who come to us to rebuild their lives and to move forward in a positive way. So we're keen to replicate the safe space that we have in Swindon, and to open a second project later this year on the south coast, which will be able to complement one of our existing women-only domestic abuse services. So we're really excited to be able to see that specialist provision grow and increase, and to meet the demand as we go forward. So I could talk all day about kind of the work that we're seeking to do, but I wanted to focus this session particularly on the LGBTQ safe space work. And then I'm going to now hand back to Bethan, who can open up the session to questions. So, thank you.
Hi, and if I can just welcome back all of our speakers. I just want to take a moment to say thank you so much to all four of you. I know I found it all really incredibly powerful, John, especially your talking about your personal experiences. I know from the chat as well that the audience has been very touched and moved by your experiences. We've had an awful lot of questions, so I'm going to crack right on with them. The first one is a really quick one. Tina, I think you might be able to help us out here. You mentioned a statistic around the number of people feeling uncomfortable with operatives entering their homes. Was that was from a Stonewall study?
No, right? It's from No Place Like Home, which is the House Proud, which Riverside supported, and I think Clarion and a couple of others supported. And that's House Proud piece of research carried out by the University of Surrey. and that was around social housing tenants. They interviewed, they spoke to. Yeah, 21%. And actually, we're doing quite a targeted piece of training at the moment. We're doing a piece of training for Network Homes at the moment, where we're training their maintenance operatives, and it's something that we've done quite a lot in the past. And I know that in the past, maintenance operatives have had training around domestic abuse, but they don't really get any training around LGBTQ people. And actually, they're the people that are kind of seeing people the most in the most personal settings. And we hear lots of narrative around people taking away, that comment I said about de-gaying their homes sounds a bit odd, but that's actually what happens. And also, we've heard there are quite, there are some really positive stuff, but there are lots of things I could say around, maintenance operatives who refuse to work with, they've left people's flats because those people identify as LGBTQ and refuse to work with them. We were working with one organisation where one of their operatives had refused to work with someone because they were trans, just walked out of the flat, refused to do it. And so we actually think that that's a really important piece of training, and it's something that we're particularly focusing on at the moment. Because 21% is quite a lot of people, isn't it? And it's your own safe, your where you live is meant to be your safe space. And actually, and often and it can be the kind of conversation that maintenance operatives have between them that people can overhear and all those kinds of things. So yeah, for us, it's a really important thing. Sorry, I could go on about it forever. So
thank you, Tina. Anna, I've got one here for you, and it's from a chief executive of a small housing association who provides housing and support to older people over the age of 60. And they're asking, how can they be a positive, non-tokenistic ally? Have you got any advice?
Yes, definitely. Well, what I mentioned when I was speaking about the Builder Safer Choices report, and we did that piece of work with Tina from Stonewall Housing, but also with an organisation called Opening Doors London. And Opening Doors actually do an accreditation scheme called Pride in Care. And this is something that housing providers can go through that process. So it's specifically for providers of older persons housing. There are other accreditation schemes that Stonewall Housing do in relation to general housing provision, but the Pride in Care particularly looks at the care and support element as well as the housing. And it's things like that. It's actually getting into the deeper aspects of this. So, it's one thing, a lot of people talk about visibility is really important. So, coming out as an organisation before you expect your residents to come out is really important. But it is important what that signage is. So, it's not just pinning up a rainbow flag that you bought off Amazon, for example. It needs to be so much more than that. So, putting up something that says you are actually going to undergo an accreditation scheme, you're going to look detailed at the training of your staff, it's going to be meaningful engagement, then absolutely, this isn't, we don't purport that, tonic's going to be the answer for everyone. There needs to be a mixture of, community-led initiatives and initiatives from the mainstream, as we've just heard from Guy, really well in terms of what Stonewater are doing.
Thank you, Anna. John, I wonder if this is a question perhaps that you could help us with, as you're based in Manchester. That's right, isn't it? You're in Manchester, John. You're muted, sorry.
Hi, sorry, Beth, and I was on mute. We have a thing in our workplace where we have to pay £5 to a cancer charity every time we do that. So that's another £5 for me. So yeah, we've got services in Manchester.
So the question here is, what does the panel think about the north-south divide in terms of services for people who are LGBT+? Do you think there is a divide, and if so, do you have any thoughts about that?
So I think there is definitely a divide, and I think that because historically there's been a greater sense of communities sometimes in the bigger cities, I don't even know if it's north or south divide, I think it's the bigger cities. So places like London, Manchester, Brighton have got a more active, visible LGBT community. Therefore, I think services are developed by them, for them, in partnership with organisations. I think it's when you get out to smaller cities where it's less visible, the demand maybe is less, that I think that it's much harder to find dedicated services, not just housing, all kinds of dedicated services are fewer and far between when you get to the smaller cities further across the north and other parts of the country. So I do think there's a divide, and I do think that sometimes it's, well, people say there's not a demand. There's not demand because we haven't done the work to find out and done the research and engaged with the communities.
Yeah, I would say one of the things about, in terms of homelessness particularly, there's a lot of talk about beacon cities. So LGBTQ people drawn to beacon cities, those cities that John was talking about. And then when you get to those cities, because there's a perception that there'll be more services, there'll be more people like you often fall through the cracks because you're not entitled, because you have no local connection, you're not entitled to any housing. And in actual fact, a lot of the people that we see in those beacon cities have often come from areas where there are no services to those beacon cities, and then find themselves street homeless because of not being able to get any form of housing. So I think, like John, it's not north-south. I think it's about those beacon cities and the perception that those are better places to be LGBTQ, definitely.
And can I just add to that in terms of actually working more collaboratively? So Tonic has been working with the LGBT Foundation in Manchester, for example, who are working on an extra care scheme there. We're working collectively with different organisations. The research that I talked about, the Building Safer Choices study, that was very much it took quite a long time to evolve because it was a community-led study. So members of the community wrote the survey with us and we tested it with people, and we think that's why we got such a high response rate. We got over 600 responses even during lockdown across London. We shared that with Manchester. They used that as the basis for their study in Manchester, and we're really happy to share that with other parts of the country, so that rather than having to reinvent the wheel every time, we can start growing that evidence base using the same approaches to that. Obviously, they'll have their local influences on it and people can adapt and change it. But yeah, very much do reach out if that's something you're interested in doing.
I think that collaboration is so important. And whilst I talked about our domestic abuse safe space in Swindon, that was very much based on learning that we'd seen from an earlier project up in Manchester and down in the southeast. But we purposely went for the southwest because for that very reason, as we've described it, is that actually there isn't massive provision in that space, but people do still exist. But actually we've been able to cross support, so we will receive referrals from people, say from Manchester, who actually want to get away from their local environment for a period of time. It's a network of organisations working together that is really most effective.
Thank you. So the message there is collaborate. Guy, coming straight back to you, actually, I was wondering, so this question here is about, you mentioned that Stonewater is particularly good at personalising the support for residents. Do you have any advice for other people from housing associations about how you go about doing that?
Well, I think with personalising any service is ultimately, I guess, about understanding the individual and talking to them and listening to them. I'll actually reference our older people service actually, rather than our specific LGBT working around that. So we've been looking at our retirement living schemes and shifting those early conversations with people who come to us away from focusing on their needs and their vulnerabilities to fundamentally asking them kind of what's important to them, what do they want to bring, what they're going to bring if they move into our communities, the communities that we're living. I think it's about that. It's about really focusing on understanding the individual as an individual, and then being able to access and put around the support, if that's what was required, or the assistance to help to achieve their aspirations, whether that's around domestic abuse or in any circumstance. Fundamentally, it's about understanding the person.
Thank you.
So Bethany, I've just add to that. So I agree with Guy about the strength-based approach, and I think one of the other things that we think is important is creating that safe environment. So throughout the year having events, Pride events, LGBT History Week events, all the rest of it, having many of our staff wear rainbow lanyards. And that's a conversation piece. In our retirement living schemes, we have awareness sessions. We have other campaigns, such as we have the No Bystanders campaign, which is about not ignoring LGBTQ homophobic abuse or hate crime. Also come out for LGBTQ with our chief exec with a rainbow flag behind her and a come out for LGBTQ poster. And it's that kind of thing, that because it's about your customers, but it's also really very much about your staff, making sure that they're on board, so that people feel able to come out in a key working session and talk about the issues that really matter to them.
Thank you. I want to make sure that this question doesn't get lost, and there's a lot of questions coming through, but this one is actually a personal question from somebody in the audience who says that, as the mother of an autistic bisexual teenager, are there any particular groups that you know of supporting younger autistic people who are preparing to strike out on their own? I'm not directing that at any one particular person, sorry.
We're all a bit not sure. Depends, I think, geographically where you are, because depending on where you are, there may be youth groups. I mean, I know, bizarrely enough, I know there's a youth group in Gloucester because my granddaughter's in it. So it often depends on kind of where you are locally. And I would say, if you've got a local LGBT group, then connect with them and see. I can't think of anything kind of any national group, if you like, but I'm sure that maybe some of the like the National Autistic Charity, I think that's what they're called, they may have done, I think they've done some work around sexual orientation and autism. So I think, but I would say look for a local group and see from them, because I can't think of anything kind of, there is no kind of national group that I can think of, but it might be that I can't think of them at the moment, but there might be. Sorry, that's a very vague answer. I apologise for that.
No, I think that's helpful. Thank you. So we're getting a few questions asking about some challenges that are being faced by housing associations who are working within, of course, very varied communities, in particular with reference to the kind of pockets of community that might have varying views and opinions on LGBTQ plus people. Do you have any advice or can you touch on any experiences that you might have had of working within to kind of educate and make sure that your offer is inclusive for all? Does that make sense of the question? I'm kind of trying to decipher several questions into one. I'm not sure who I'm directing that at. Would any of you like to speak on that?
Go, John. Go.
I'm happy to make a start. For us and the way we operate, and I think the way that I believe is the right way forward, is it's about a celebration of diversity. So we have different, we have a BAME group, we have a disability group, we have LGBTQ group, all those groups work together. Because actually, having a protected characteristic means we've all got something in common. So we talk about what we've got in common, and we have a joint event each year with all the groups coming together for a conference, and we have speakers that touch all of us because we've all lived with a protected characteristic. So I think it's about awareness, it's about education, and I think it's about promoting what we've got in common and the shared experiences that we've got in common. But equally, we have to tackle discrimination when it raises its ugly head, and we've got a zero tolerance around that. Now, that doesn't mean we come down heavy-handed right away, because it is about education, training, and bringing people with you. But at the same time, there's a level that we won't accept, a level of discrimination. So it's about celebrating diversity, working together, celebrating what we've got in common, but dealing with outright discrimination when it happens.
Yeah, as an education provider, I would say training all the time, but training where you do something with it. So it's not enough to just train your staff, give everybody rainbow lanyards and say, that's it, we've done it now, aren't we great? It has to be, you have to revisit the training time and time again. You have to do refreshers. You have to, and also when things come up from training, and I've trained a few organisations where things have come up and that have been quite challenging in the training room, and then when you have those conversations with people commissioning the training, nothing really happens with it. And it's about, I'm not saying that you should come down hard on your staff, but it's about recognizing that you have to face those challenges. And often people are concerned about what's going to happen if they, you have to face them head on. You have to have, and that zero tolerance thing, we have this thing when we, in terms of equalities training, about you can't have true equality if you don't recognize diversity. We're all diverse, and what John was saying about, you celebrate it, but you educate people around it, and not being frightened to have those difficult conversations. 15, 20 years ago, we were having difficult conversations with staff about racism. We should be having those same conversations about homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, because actually the challenge, in some ways, there are lots of differences, but in some ways the challenge is the same. So being prepared to face the challenge head on and work with it, definitely, as a trainer, I would say.
Maybe I can just kind of follow on and give an example of that, because when we actually undertook training of the care team in the scheme that we're going to be involved in very shortly. This was pre-lockdown just. We actually, one of the questions that came up was actually about different rights. So, for example, people's religious perspective, and whether that actually took precedent over other rights, for example. So people in the training session, and I think this is how training is done really well, when it is interactive and it enables people to work through these issues openly and safely, then you actually really start to get change, rather than training that's just delivered at people. Yeah. So this conversation was with a group of care staff, or about 15 people there. They were working out actually as a team amongst themselves, which was really interesting to do, and talking about actually, no, when you are delivering, you're in a service provider and you're delivering care to your customers, you didn't, even if you have your religious perspective on that, and you are entitled to have your religious identity, you have a duty of care to your customer, and they have their rights in terms of the Equality Act. So that your perspective can't kind of trump somebody else's right, if that makes sense. And I thought that's a really good example of actually getting into that nitty-gritty, and then the organisation has something concrete that they can actually take forward in terms of how they actually deal with situations.
I think the other piece is to recognise that, particularly when you're looking at specific services, it's recognising that they're over and above, they're in addition, they're not instead of, perhaps what might be seen as mainstream services. I've been personally incredibly saddened to hear so a lot of the very negative criticism that we've had from very prominent people within the domestic abuse sector about the work that we've done supporting LGBT survivors. I think what we really tried to push is that we're not providing services instead of services for women and children. We get that in pure numbers terms, the biggest number of survivors are from women, are women, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working alongside and complementing and supporting those. And actually, we'd like to see the whole, particularly in this instance, the domestic abuse sector, really coming together to work to eradicate domestic abuse. Actually, to show that we can tackle it in a specific area and work collaboratively is the key to it. And I think that really addresses that point. We're not fighting against one another. This is about being inclusive, means it's about making sure that there's wider and additional provision for the people who really need it.
Thank you, everybody. So we've got 5 minutes left of the webinar, and I think this next question we might have time for one, maybe two more questions after this. So Tina, you mentioned giving advice on best practice for LGBTQ plus tenants, but I'm wondering, I think this is probably a question for each of you, because I think you'll all have some good advice and tips for attendees of the webinar to take away with them today. But Tina, if we start with you, do you have any examples or ideas for people on the call for how they can engage better with LGBTQ plus residents?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that training thing again, because for us, it's about what John was saying about celebrating, but it's about investing in your staff and investing in best practice, and commission the training, do it regularly, and follow it up, and make sure that it's part of what you know, to create this best practice. Absolutely. We would say from a training perspective, and like I was saying earlier, don't be frightened to have some of those challenging conversations, because actually, like Anna says, you can work out, your staff can work out in those kind of interactive, collective way, the way forward, really. And I think, yeah, so as a trainer, training is the thing that I think is really important, but a commitment to it, not just to tick books.
Thank you. Anna, should we come to you next?
Yeah, sure. So I would kind of really highlight tools like the House Proud Pledge Scheme. You know, it's been set up as a framework so that it's easy for housing providers to engage with. And particularly for me, what's really important about the House Proud Pledge Scheme is that it very much takes a resident-led perspective in there. So, you know, about supporting LGBT residents groups, you know, this kind of dispelling this idea that a resident group for everybody is going to be inclusive. A lot of people that I've spoken to feel really intimidated by going to a mainstream resident group. You know, you have to think a little bit differently. You have to kind of put yourself in your customer's shoes, so to speak, and see what they're asking for and what they feel comfortable with. And then as a group, they may establish that kind of confidence and get more engaged with the wider agenda. So House Proud really supports that kind of approach to actually making change. And the change, you know, the evidence of progress can actually be measured by your residents' experience of that change. You know, they can tell you what's important, they can tell you what's different, which is why the pledge is set up, that it can be, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It is to be flexible, to work for the organisation involved and to work with your residents to see what's most important for them.
Thanks. Guy?
I'd agree with all of that. I've just, I suppose, a little bit to add. I think the power of stories is and creating spaces to share those very personal stories and to build networks with them, just encouraging people to see themselves or connections amongst customer groups, I think, and finding ways to be able to connect people. And I think, I know what you're saying around customer groups is really important, is that particularly as people are dispersed, is how do you connect people who might have something in common elsewhere, make sure that people are comfortable to share their stories and experiences, and to bring, we want diverse range of voices, we want to hear from everybody, but people will only feel happy to share if they feel comfortable and that it's what they say is going to be acknowledged and respected.
Thank you. And John, just before we close, did you have any final remarks on that?
Yeah, so I think for me, I agree with what's been said so far. Engage with your customers. Now, whether that's starting by a survey to look at who's interested, whether it be LGBTQ and allies, about getting involved in some kind of forum. Particularly now, it's so much easier to do an online forum and connect virtually. Create an action-focused plan that the customers own and deal with the issues that they're sharing with you about their experiences, from sign up right through to reporting a repair. And one quick example would be that was flagged with us was around misgendering. Our call centre were misgendering a trans tenant. And it was about delivering some training within the call centre around that, but then also taking it out a little bit further to make it simple. So rather than assuming someone's got a wife, for example, just use the term partner, use the term they and them. So use gender neutral language rather than making it overcomplicated. You know, can I ask if your partner a man or a woman and all that kind of thing? You don't need to do that. Make it simple and easy for staff, but train staff and engage with your customers.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. And we have reached midday. So I'm going to close up now. A huge thank you to all of you for speaking with us today. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending everybody an email in the next week or so, which is going to include a link to the recording of this webinar. I really hope you enjoyed today's webinar as much as we did. Just before you go, we'd really appreciate it if you could answer this quick poll, which is rating today's webinar. I also wanted to mention, while you're doing that, the National Housing Summit Early Bird ends tomorrow. Confirmed speakers include Robert Jenrick, our Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Thagam Debonair, who's Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, as well as Sian Berry, co-leader of the Green Party. You can find out more about that and all of our other upcoming webinars at housing.org.uk/event. Thank you everybody for listening today.